Hello and welcome back to the Student Hub Live Open Justice event. In this last session, I'm joined by Ruth McFarlane and James Megan. Sorry, we had a typo on the slide for those of you who may have saw that. And we're going to be talking about public legal education to prisoners and in prison. So some big issues here. I mean, the OEU is one of the best providers, I think you said, James, of higher education to prisoners. But there are lots of issues here around who can be educated, how they're educated, and also some of the restorative aspects of that education in terms of a benefit to prisoners. So some huge issues here. Ruth, you've been teaching students in prison and you have a lot of experience of this from that side. And James, you're from our Department of Criminology at the Open University in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. So thank you for joining us because you have some ideas about the theoretical side of things.
Yeah.
Okay, so first let's think about how we actually do prison education. I mean, there are issues here that our students may not think about. The first issue, I guess, that would be useful to talk about is that they don't have access to the internet like our students do. And for students who rely on the VLE, the virtual learning environment, that must have a phenomenal impact. So how do students access study and how do they study, Ruth?
Well, so for students studying at higher education level, and most of them will be accessing Open University courses, there's a few options. Most of them will probably be using books and paper and will be writing their assignments by hand and will be dependent on other people bringing them information. They won't have any access to the internet at all. All students in prison will be restricted on internet usage. Some of them will be able to use what's called the virtual campus, which is a locked down intranet, which offers some of the same activities as are available on the VLE, but quite restricted. So, for example, they won't be allowed to use the forums for any communication. They won't be allowed to sort of go out and do any searching external to the VLE, and some of the content will be restricted as well. So it's not. It's tricky, I think, and there's lots of issues that we'd like to talk about even if the virtual campus is theoretically available, the actual practicalities of getting the student to the computer in prison are very tricky.
Now, we've got some widgets that we'd like your feedback on. So should students in secure environments be allowed to use cell phones or a computer in their cells as a study aid? Have you ever written a 3,000-word essay by hand? And is higher education for prisoners a privilege or an entitlement? And what do you think might be some of the big barriers to learning for prisoners, and we're going to be talking about some of those soon. James, when you and I were talking on the phone, we both said that in our early days we have written very long essays in our first degrees by hand, and that wasn't all that long ago. It's really, really difficult to do things like that, but I imagine it must also be very difficult to access things. I mean, having all of these printouts and you know, ways of studying must be difficult. But Ruth, you ended by talking about access to things. So in prisons, we were saying that one of the primary things was GCSE and getting people levelled up to those qualifications. And higher education seemed to be more of a luxury, something that people did for fun, to relax maybe. And so getting access to somebody who may be able to take them somewhere where they could access their study materials may be complicated. How does it work?
Well, so the priority for the learning providers in prisons is for people to be doing maths and English functional skills to level 1 and 2, so GCSE level. If you are lucky enough to have progressed through that, and for a lot of prisoners, their starting point at their education will be quite low, having had quite negative education experiences. If they're lucky enough to have progressed and to be keen to be studying at a higher education level, it might be that they're required to work a day job, and so their education has to fit in around that. And the chances are that the computers on which they're able to access the virtual campus are in the education unit, which means they have to go through perhaps 15 locked gates to get there, and that requires a member of staff to take them. And then when they get there might be 5 students who all want to use 3 computers, and they can only get there on a Tuesday evening between 5 and 7. And so some of those restrictions really sort of bring home how complicated it is to be studying at this level in prison. You have to be really determined. It's James and I were saying earlier that there's a perception that students in prison have all the time in the world, that they're sitting around in their cell with nothing to do. But that's really not the case. They'll be expected to be doing a lot of work and chores, and it's a very noisy environment. They're probably sharing their cell with somebody, and there'll be lots of distractions which really don't make it easy. So they have to be very determined. But those people who do it, it's wonderful to hear how much they benefit from it and how much they get.
Yeah, that's right, and it's interesting what you're saying about the computer, and the digital divide is something that's really kind of come on in the last few years. As we were saying, we wrote essays by hand and maybe typed them up afterwards, but no students are doing that today. But prisoners are doing it every day, and it's really difficult. And when we're designing courses, we have to factor that in. We have to factor in people in secure environments, because you're worried that how will they access this material? How will it come out in printed format? And so while the internet provides these fantastic learning opportunities for students on the outside, there's a real risk of leaving behind those on the other side of the digital divide. And that also applies not just to prisoners, but to people who are perhaps elderly and don't have experience with the internet and so forth. And this is a small group, but it's a group of students that we must not forget.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, on the digital divide, a lot of our students who've been successful with their OU degrees in prison have been in prison for quite a few years, largely because the higher security prisons tend to be a more settled environment, and it's easier to access education, and you're there for a longer period, you build up better relationships with the staff. But if you've been in prison for 10 years, you've never seen a smartphone, and you don't know how to use a touch screen, and even just a VLE, even the walled garden, it's really important that we are allowing people in prison to have these opportunities to learn about technology if we want them to be gainfully employed when they come out and to have jobs. You can't do a job in anything now without using a computer in some form.
But how does that play out in terms of impact? I mean, if somebody is in prison, that must limit some of the potentials, in particular if they're studying something like law, for example.
Well, most prisoners would struggle to carry on to a job as a solicitor or barrister if they've been in prison, and it's not an absolute bar to a career in the law, but it's a pretty major hurdle. And so, but at the same time, the value of a degree isn't solely in what increasing your earning capacity afterwards or whatever. There is huge value in increasing personal confidence, increasing sense of achievement, and for many prisoners to go from very little educational experience before they go in to graduating either when they're in prison or just after they get out is a huge achievement, and can help them to develop in other ways far beyond the workplace and their earning potential.
I mean, the OU do a lot. They do graduation ceremonies, for example. What sort of support do students get then from the Open University in terms of access to tutors? You've talked a little bit about the materials and graduation.
What do you want to James?
Sure. Well, I'm also a tutor, and I have at the moment I have 4 prison students. One in a Category A high security prison, 1 in an open prison, and 2 in, I'm going to say B, but maybe C category. And I speak to them before each essay on the phone for about an hour, and before the exam for about an hour. And when I can, I will go and arrange a face-to-face tutorial with the students. So the support they get is the equivalent of what they're getting on. Well, it's not the equivalent in number of hours, I suppose, but in terms of how many times they have contact with their tutor, it is pretty close to the same as a student on the outside. And we have had students in the past who have been in open prison and have been able to attend tutorials on their release on temporary licence and so forth. So they've come into London from outside London in prison, and they've joined the class as a normal student. So it varies depending on the circumstance of the student, but they should usually get contact from their tutor in the same as if they were close to as if they were on the outside. So we do work pretty hard to support them once they're in the system with us.
It won't always be direct contact with the tutor, will it? They'll have to go through an intermediary member of staff, and so that requires them to have a good relationship with that member of staff.
So there would be a telephone tutorial, for example. They would have the same number of, in the module I teach, they would have the same number of telephone tutorials as the students on the outside would have face-to-face tutorials. So that would be how we would manage that. But you're right, if they have a question, or if they want to ask for an extension, or if they don't think that's one of the pieces of something doesn't make sense or they don't have a piece of material, they have to ask a member of staff to email their tutor, to email them back, to pass it on. And it is like Chinese whispers, and it does involve managing the relationship with the prison, and it often comes down to the personality of the individual education officer. So it's very much mediated by that individual, as well as the tutorial contact.
And I think that's reflected in the stats that we see. James and I were having a quick look at the stats on the usage of the virtual campus over the last few months. There's a few prisons where there is quite good usage, but there's a large number of prisons where nobody at all is using it. And that's probably not because double negative, sorry, it's probably not because there aren't people at that level, but it's because they're just not able to get to the computers, and that can be for all sorts of different reasons.
So in your experience, are there very real barriers that can fluctuate and change depending on maybe what's happening in the prison at the time?
Yes, absolutely. It can be about staff numbers and costs, and about what else is going on, and yes, whether the education department is open that day or not, who else needs to be using the computers. That may be that priority is given to people doing the functional skills qualifications. The virtual campus is also used for resettlement purposes, so for looking at housing and jobs and things. So there'll be lots of other pressures of people wanting to be able to use the computers, and if there's only a limited number of them, and with money tight, and we know that there's staffing issues in prisons as well, so lots of things. It's not that a prisoner is sitting there in their cell with all of this available to them.
That's right.
We've spoken about the social justice and the mission of the Open University and how a lot of this fits into that. But one of the other things that the OU holds dear is the idea of open access. So anybody can theoretically study. But how does that play out in prison environments? I mean, is it open access, or are there other barriers like literacy, English as a first language, that can really prevent students from being able to engage with higher education?
Well, the Open University can only look after students who have the literacy level to read our materials and the control of English to read our materials. So we can't teach people English, and we can't teach people literacy. We do have foundation courses to help people get started in third level education, but overall we can only help a very small proportion of the prison population because literacy levels in the prison population are so low. Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's because a lot of people in prison have had very difficult education experiences. I don't think it necessarily reflects their academic ability. I think it reflects their life circumstances and the fact that school probably wasn't very easy, and perhaps they didn't spend very much time in school. And I think I said to you when we were talking on the phone, Karen, that the young people I was working with in a secure training centre, so 12 to 16-year-olds in custody, our stats showed that for every 3 months that they were with us, they made a year's worth of academic progress in maths and English. And that was the average. So some of them were making more progress than that. And that was because they were in a settled environment with small groups, with intensive teaching and support, and also because it was a safer place. It was okay for them to acknowledge the difficulties that they were having and to be at this lower starting point. They've probably been really embarrassed by their literacy levels, and it's really hard to admit that once you're an adult and to say, actually, I can't read. And most people will try and cover that up. So that's another of the barriers. But in terms of OU students, I think all students in prison are encouraged to start on an access module to sort of get a taster and see if this is right for them and understand about studying at this level and what's involved and the greater degree of independence.
Excellent. I'd like to take a quick trip to the hot desk and see what you've been talking about at home. Sophie and HJ.
Yes, there's a lot of really good questions going on in the chat, actually. We're wondering if students in prison are vetted beforehand, or maybe if there are any subjects that they can't take, as well as reoffending rates and the positive impact that this has. Are there any stats on this, or, I'm assuming there's a positive impact, but how is this measured?
Okay, so the
Some
first,
really good questions there.
really good questions, yeah. So on the first one, yes, absolutely, there is a limit on what students are allowed to study. So at the moment, we've got about 65 modules that are available to students, and those will be carefully vetted and selected beforehand. And it may be that some students are even further limited on what they're allowed to study. There's some which are really popular. So, like, I know that the criminology ones are very popular, aren't they? And the languages and maths and science ones. Interestingly, there was a computing module which some students were studying, which they managed to do on paper, bizarrely. And there was quite an interesting paper was written about how those materials were adapted and reversion for those students. And then the second question was about reoffending rates. So my colleague Anne Pike did a longitudinal study of students who were studying at HE level, studying their degrees in prison, and she followed them as they came out of prison and how they managed to continue. And although she found that it was very difficult for them to carry on studying once they were released, there are so many other complex factors that they were facing, living in a hostel and just learning how to reintegrate into the world after such a long time in custody. Actually, none of them had reoffended. And of course, there's, we have to define how long a period are you measuring that over, and it's usually a year, within a year of release, that measurement is taken. So that was a fairly small-scale study, and I'm interested in looking much further at that. I don't think there has been any larger-scale studies, but I think now with the Learning Together project, where a lot more universities are getting involved with engaging with students in prison, there will be more potential really for that sort of research to be happening and to look at the reoffending rates.
I'd like to look at that and your inside-out example, James. But before we do, just sort of going back to that first question that Sophie had, you were saying criminology was very popular. I know psychology is also very popular. To what extent do you see people learning as a way of making sense of things? Is that quite a popular framework to sort of have that academic background to start making sense of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. Some students do, they come to criminology and they can relate to it. They've been through the criminal justice system, they've seen it firsthand, they've seen some of the injustices of the criminal justice system firsthand. And so it does help them to relate to it. But when I'm teaching them, you've got to also remind them, that your personal story isn't necessarily academic data, and you have to kind of underpin that narrative with academic research and connect it to the theorists that we've been teaching and the data that they've been able to research, because there's a temptation sometimes for prisoners to talk about their personal story and to over-personalise criminology, which is useful in one sense in giving them perspective, but it's also it's less scientific and less academic in its approach. So there is a balance to be struck.
And you can see how that would happen. I mean, I know for the psychology students that I teach, there is also that tendency. So it may be that this is something about learning as opposed to the discipline and the situation, perhaps.
Oh, absolutely. I imagine it happens in everything, and we're trying to, use the tools of academia and the tools of your discipline without applying it strictly to your day-to-day experience and your anecdotal experience is a challenge. But and prisoners in particular, in my experience, they struggle with that in the criminological sphere, as you can imagine.
Absolutely. Ruth, you mentioned before working together with prisoners, and I know, James, we spoke earlier about an inside-out project about how people were working with prisons and how this had a mutual benefit, really, to both the prisoners and students at traditional brick universities. Is this a new trend, then, that's popular, and why?
Well, I think why is a really interesting question. I'll just talk a bit about how the project in the UK started. So two academics from Cambridge University came up with this idea of a Learning Together project whereby they take students from Cambridge into a prison and deliver seminars so that the students are studying alongside each other on an equal footing, and sometimes staff are engaged in those as well. And what they found was that it really enriched the learning to have a much wider cohort of students, really, and that it enabled the students who were at Cambridge, the outside students as they're called, to have a very direct experience of being in prison and to hear some very real stories. But it also enabled the inside students to realise that they could be part of the university learning community, that some of those barriers that they might have perceived, it helped them to realise that actually we're just like you in very many ways, and you find those connections. And so that means partly that all those students are engaging in that university level study, but also it's helping people to realise the potential. And so now, as the project is expanding and more universities are getting involved and they're going into more prisons, it means that as those prisoners are released, the first sort of cohort of those students are now coming out, and one has successfully applied to university and others are looking at jobs. And so it's really showing a whole new future, really. And I think it's proving to be really beneficial in very many ways.
And finally, James, if you could tell us about the inside-out aspects that we were discussing as well.
Well, I suppose from the OU's perspective, we don't have an inside-out programme at the moment, but for us, Inside Out is a great confidence builder for prisoners, and so in some cases, people who've been Inside Out students have gone on to take open university degrees and engage in study with us. So while we don't have a programme where our students go into prison and study inside, we do have many graduates of these Inside Out programmes coming on, and that gives them the kind of impetus to get started with doing a full degree rather than the small Inside Out programme that they're able to do with other universities.
Excellent. And again, what we've seen today is that law is very, very dynamic, and there are so many new shifts, and this is a great example of one that's both, good for students as well as having a good for society. Ruth and James, thank you so much for coming along tonight. That's all we've got time for. I hope you've enjoyed the programme that we've put on. We do have other Student Hub Live events, and if you're here tonight, one you might be interested in is our careers session on criminology, which is on the 16th of May. So if you'd like to find out more, you can come on our mailing list, click on the Count Me In button, and we'll let you know when we've got future events. Sophie and HJ, let's just take a quick trip to see any final thoughts from you two from the hot desk.
I think just overall we've had a lot of great and different and interesting discussions about law today, different issues like technology and access to information and knowing what to access and how people can get involved in lots of different volunteering opportunities. So it's very good. And like we said earlier, there's lots of great resources on the website as well that you should definitely check out as well.
Yeah. It's definitely inspired me. I think I'm going to go and have a look at some volunteering opportunities near me. And yeah, it's been really nice to chat with everyone. It's been quite serious. I think we've done very well to stay on task today. We've done very well, yeah. Proud of us.
Excellent. Well, thank you both, and thank you for participating, either if you've been watching on the catch-up or live on real time. I hope you've enjoyed the experience here. As Sophie and HJ say, there are lots of resources on the website. Do stay connected to us. You've got the hashtag and you've got the email address on the website. If there are any questions that we haven't managed to answer, we will get back to you if you let us know. But that's all from us today at the Student Hub Live, and thank you so much for watching, and we hope to see you very soon.